There are sounds the forest makes that don't belong in any field guide. I first heard it in late June of 2009 during my third week stationed at the Ho River Trail Observation Post. A low, guttural hum, not quite mammalian, not quite human, that seemed to rise from the moss itself. It lasted maybe 8 seconds. Then silence. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. My name is Dr. Aaron Feldman. I'm a wildlife ecologist specializing in apex predator behavior and territorial patterns. For 9 consecutive summers, I documented what I believed, what I knew, to be a female member of an undiscovered hominid species living within a 3-mile radius of the Salduke Falls backcountry. I filmed her 17 times. I recorded her vocalizations on 4 separate occasions. I cataloged her seasonal movements, her foraging patterns, and what I can only describe as caregiving behavior toward at least one juvenile. And then, in August of 2017, the National Park Service closed a 40-square-mile section of the forest to all public access. No explanation, no press release, just orange tape, locked gates, and a bureaucratic wall of silence. This is not a story about monsters. It's a story about boundaries, the ones we cross, the ones we should respect, and the ones that protect something far older than our need to know. The Ho rainforest is one of the quietest places in the contiguous United States. The density of old-growth Sitka spruce and western hemlock creates what acousticians call a sound shadow, a natural dampening effect where even your own footsteps seem muffled. The understory is thick with sword ferns and nurse logs blanketed in moss so green it looks artificially saturated. Roosevelt elk move like ghosts. Black bears avoid confrontation. The forest has its rhythms, its codes, and somewhere within those codes, a family had learned to exist unseen. I didn't come here looking for cryptids. I came here to study wolf reintroduction patterns, but the forest had other plans. And once you've seen something that shouldn't exist, once you've locked eyes with intelligence that mirrors your own, there's no returning to the comfortable ignorance of data sets and peer review. Some discoveries aren't meant to be published. Some knowledge carries the weight of guardianship. This is mine. My fieldwork began as routine ecological monitoring. Each summer, I'd spend 12 weeks tracking predator-prey dynamics, setting up motion-activated cameras, and documenting behavioral changes in the local elk population. The Park Service provided minimal resources, a backcountry permit, a satellite phone for emergencies, and the understanding that I was largely on my own. The work was methodical. Wake before dawn, check camera traps, log GPS coordinates, record temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, document scat composition and track patterns in the soft earth near creek beds, return to base camp before dusk, review footage, sleep, repeat. The Olympic Peninsula receives upward of 12 feet of rain annually in some areas. Everything is perpetually damp. Your boots never truly dry. Your notebooks warp despite the waterproof cases. The forest smells of decay and growth happening simultaneously. That rich, loamy scent of things dying to feed what lives. I had 4 camera stations positioned along a 7-mile loop from the Ho River Trail to the Blue Glacier approach. Station 3, located near an unnamed tributary about 2.3 miles from the nearest marked trail, consistently produced anomalous results. The first was in July 2009, a motion trigger at 3:47 a.m. The infrared footage showed what I initially assumed was a bear standing upright to mark a tree, except the posture was wrong, the proportions were wrong, and the gait, when it turned and moved back into the frame for just under 4 seconds, was bipedal, fluid, purposeful. I reviewed that footage 60 times. Bears can walk upright, but not like that. Not with that stride length, that arm swing, that deliberate placement of foot in front of foot. I reported it as unidentified large mammal in my field notes. I didn't mention it to the Park Service. Something told me not to. The second incident came 3 weeks later. I was hauling equipment along the Ridgeline Trail when I found a Sitka spruce branch, roughly 4 inches in diameter, snapped cleanly at chest height, and wedged into the fork of a neighboring tree. No storm had passed through. No windfall explained it. The break was fresh, the cambium still weeping sap. I'm 6'2". The break was at my eye level. Whatever did this was tall, strong, and sending a message. In grizzly country, rangers tell you to watch for trees marked with claw scratches, territorial signaling. This felt similar, but the execution was more sophisticated. This wasn't scratching bark. This was engineering, manipulation of the environment to communicate presence. I began adjusting my routes to pass Station 3 more frequently. The forest there felt different, denser, older. The canopy was so thick that even midday felt like twilight. There were game trails, elk mostly, but also paths that didn't match any known species. Wide, flat impressions in the moss, spacing that suggested a stride length of nearly 5 feet. I collected plaster casts. The first was inconclusive, too much moisture degradation. The second, taken in late August after a brief dry spell, was better. 17 inches long, 7 inches wide at the ball, 5 distinct toes, but the proportions were closer to human than ape. The dermal ridges were visible along the arch. I sent photographs to a colleague at Berkeley who specialized in primate morphology. Her response was cautious. Interesting. Could be artifacted. Could be genuine. I'd need the physical cast. What's the provenance? I told her I'd found it along a remote trail. I didn't tell her where. I didn't tell her I'd started sleeping in the field 3 nights a week, waiting. By September, I had modified my schedule. I stopped checking the other stations as frequently. I focused entirely on the 3-mile radius around Station 3. I brought better audio equipment, a parabolic microphone, a Zoom H6 recorder, wind-protected lapel mics. The forest rewarded patience. On September 19th, just after sunset, I heard it again, that low, resonant hum, but this time it was answered. A higher pitch, shorter duration, then silence. I didn't move for 40 minutes. When I finally stood, my legs had gone numb from crouching, but I'd captured 7 minutes of audio, 2 distinct vocalizations, layered beneath the ambient sounds of evening insects and distant water. I played it back in camp that night, headphones on, volume maxed. The first voice, the deeper one, had a structure, not random, not animal distress. There was intentionality. The second voice responded in kind, the tonal shifts mirroring the first. This was communication. I submitted my initial wolf study findings to the Park Service in October and requested permission to extend my field season into the following summer. They approved without question. Budget cuts meant fewer researchers were volunteering for long-term backcountry work. I returned in May 2010 with better equipment and a singular focus. I had abandoned my original research entirely. I told no one. My grant applications referenced expanded carnivore behavioral studies. My field notes remained deliberately vague, but in my private journals, kept in cipher stored separately, I documented everything, because I had seen her, just once, at the edge of my peripheral vision, on the last day of September 2009, a shape moving through the understory with the ease of something that belonged there, massive shoulders, a head that turned toward me for just a fraction of a second, and then, nothing. But I knew the way you know you're being watched in the dark, the way prey animals know when they've entered a predator's territory. I wasn't alone in that forest, and I was being allowed to stay. The summer of 2010 established patterns that would define the next 7 years of my life. I learned to read the signs. A cairn of stones near the creek meant stay back. A branch stripped of bark and left across the trail meant too close. These weren't accidental formations. They appeared within hours of me pushing too far into the core territory. A dense grove of old-growth cedar and hemlock roughly 1.2 miles northwest of Station 3. I respected the boundaries. In return, I was granted proximity. By mid-July, I had visual confirmation. She emerged from the tree line near dusk while I sat motionless against a nurse log, downwind, camera ready. She was perhaps 8 feet tall, though estimating height at that distance, and in failing light meant margin for error. Her body was covered in dark brown hair, matted in places, graying around the shoulders. She moved with a pronounced limp, left leg favoring the right. She was foraging, digging for roots with hands that looked disturbingly human, long fingers, opposable thumbs. She worked methodically, pausing every 30 seconds to scan her surroundings. I filmed for 11 minutes. She never looked directly at me, but I knew she knew. There's a difference between being unnoticed and being tolerated. Her body language, the angle of her shoulders, the casual efficiency of her movements, told me I had been assessed and deemed non-threatening. When she left, she didn't flee. She simply stood, brushed dirt from her hands in a gesture so human it sent chills through me, and walked back into the forest. I didn't follow. That footage remains the clearest documentation I ever captured. You can see the musculature, the gait, the clear signs of injury. You can see her pause to smell something in her palm before eating it. You can see intelligence. I titled the file Subject A, July 14, 2010, and stored it on an encrypted drive. By August, the Park Service began asking questions. Not about her, they had no idea, but about my research productivity. Where were my wolf findings? Why hadn't I submitted interim reports? I fabricated data. I'm not proud of that. I pulled behavioral studies from Yellowstone and adapted them to fit Olympic ecology. I invented GPS collar tracks based on predictive models. I gave them what they expected. Dry, academic confirmation that reintroduced predator populations were stabilizing. They were satisfied. I was granted funding for 2011, but I wasn't alone in the field anymore. In late August 2010, a family of 4 went missing on the Bogachiel Trail, about 7 miles south of my primary research zone. Massive search and rescue operation, helicopters, K-9 units, volunteer civilians combing the backcountry. They found the family 3 days later, dehydrated and hypothermic but alive, nearly 9 miles off trail in terrain they had no business surviving. The father, a software engineer from Bellevue, told a story that didn't make the official reports. He said something had herded them, moved them away from cliff edges, away from deadfalls toward water sources. He described sounds that felt like instructions, and a presence that was protective, not predatory. The official report cited disorientation and luck. I knew better. The search and rescue operation had pushed right through her territory. She had responded not with aggression, but with redirection. She had protected humans who had stumbled into her world. That changed my understanding entirely. This wasn't just a reclusive species avoiding contact. This was active management of territory in a way that minimized harm to both sides. She had agency. She had ethics. I began documenting differently. I stopped thinking like a scientist cataloging a specimen and started thinking like an anthropologist observing a culture. In 2011, I witnessed behavior that confirmed what I suspected. She had a juvenile. It happened in early July. I had positioned myself at a vantage point overlooking a meadow where I'd documented her foraging before. She emerged as expected, but this time she was followed. Smaller, maybe 5 feet tall, with lighter hair and unsteady movement. Young, perhaps adolescent, though aging an unknown species is speculative at best. The juvenile wandered toward the creek. She vocalized, a sharp 2-syllable sound. The juvenile stopped immediately. She approached, guided it back with a hand on its shoulder, then demonstrated something, turning over rocks, selecting certain plants. She was teaching. I filmed for 23 minutes. The juvenile mimicked her movements. She corrected its technique. There was patience in her gestures, repetition, reinforcement. This was culture. This was knowledge transmission. I wept behind the camera, not from fear, not from excitement, from the sudden, crushing weight of responsibility. Because what I was witnessing was proof of something the world wasn't ready to handle. Evidence that would bring helicopters, media, researchers, trophy hunters, and the death of the very thing I was trying to understand. I couldn't publish. I couldn't share. I could only witness. By September 2011, I had 17 hours of footage across multiple encounters. Audio recordings, plaster casts, scat samples, hair samples caught on bark, everything you'd need for irrefutable scientific proof. And I kept it all locked away, because I had made a choice. I had crossed from scientist to guardian, from observer to accomplice in their continued existence. My colleagues noticed the change. I became withdrawn, declined academic conference invitations, stopped publishing. My ex-wife called it an obsession. My department chair called it burnout. Only I knew the truth. I had found something so precious, so fragile, that protecting it meant sacrificing everything I'd worked for. But that was before the others started looking. The summer of 2013 brought unwanted attention. A YouTube video went viral. Grainy smartphone footage from a day hiker who'd ventured off-trail near the Salduke Valley. The video showed something large and bipedal moving through distant trees. 43 seconds. 6 million views in 2 weeks. The footage was poor quality. Inconclusive. But it was close. Too close to my research zone. The Park Service responded with standard protocol. Increased ranger patrols, trail camera installations at popular access points, and a public statement dismissing the footage as likely a bear or elk misidentified due to distance and lighting conditions. But I knew which trail that hiker had been on, and I knew what section of forest that was. That summer, I encountered 12 separate groups of Bigfoot hunters in areas that had previously seen one hiker per week, men with telephoto lenses and thermal imaging equipment, podcasters recording on location, a film crew from a cable documentary series. I redirected every one of them away from her territory. Nothing up that way except dense brush and mosquitoes, I'd say, smiling. Better sightings down near the Queets River corridor. Most believed me. A few were suspicious. One, a YouTuber with 90,000 subscribers, accused me of gatekeeping the truth. I didn't care. Let them think what they wanted. But the pressure was mounting. The forest I'd known for its solitude was becoming a destination, and she was becoming more elusive. My camera traps went days without triggering. The vocalizations I'd grown accustomed to, those evening exchanges between mother and juvenile, went silent. She was adapting, retreating deeper, changing patterns that had been stable for 3 years. I had to do something. In August 2013, I met with the Olympic National Park Senior Wildlife Coordinator Margaret Chen. I'd worked with her peripherally for 4 years. She was practical, no-nonsense, and refreshingly skeptical of bureaucratic overreach. I didn't tell her everything, but I told her enough. There's something in the Upper Sol Duke drainage that's being disturbed by increased human traffic, I said. I'm seeing behavioral changes in the local fauna, displacement patterns, stress indicators. I think we need to consider a temporary closure of some backcountry access points to allow the ecosystem to stabilize. Margaret looked at me over her reading glasses. What kind of fauna? Large mammal. Possibly a residual population that's more sensitive to human presence than we previously understood. You're being vague, Aaron. I'm being careful. She studied me for a long moment. You've been in that forest longer than anyone in the last decade. If you're seeing something concerning, I trust your judgment. But I need something concrete to justify closure. Budget's tight. Public pushback on access restrictions is intense. I showed her thermal anomaly data from my camera traps. Movement patterns that didn't match known species profiles. Audio spectrographs showing vocalizations outside the range of cataloged wildlife. I did not show her the footage. Margaret reviewed everything in silence then. This is highly irregular. I know. And you're certain this isn't just a misidentification cascade? Researchers seeing patterns because they want to see patterns? I'm certain. She closed the folder. I'll bring it to the superintendent, no promises, but I'll advocate for a one-season closure on a limited area. Ecological recovery justification. We'll say we're monitoring erosion and watershed impact from increased foot traffic. Thank you. Aaron? She fixed me with a look. Whatever you're protecting up there, make sure it's worth your career, because that's what you're risking. I nodded. It was worth more than my career. It was worth the silence that allowed something ancient to continue existing in a world that had forgotten how to share space. The closure request was denied. Budget constraints, public access mandates, political pressure from outdoor recreation lobbies. So I continued my work with increasing desperation. I documented everything, built a redundant archive, encrypted drives stored in 3 separate locations, field notes written in code, GPS coordinates deliberately scrambled in official reports. And then, in September 2013, I saw something that changed everything again. I was hiking back to camp just after dawn when I noticed fresh digging near the creek. Not foraging behavior. This was excavation. Deliberate. Focused. I approached carefully. She had buried something. The soil was loose, recently disturbed. A cairn of river stones marked the spot. And nearby, leaning against a cedar trunk, was a branch arranged in a specific pattern. 3 shorter pieces crossed over 1 longer piece. I didn't disturb it, but I photographed it. And I understood. This was a grave. The juvenile I documented in 2011 and 2012 hadn't appeared all summer. I'd assumed it had reached an age where it ranged independently. But now, I sat down 20 feet away and wept. Not just for loss, though that was part of it, but for the crushing weight of knowing I was witness to grief in a species we'd convinced ourselves didn't exist. That this mother, this intelligent, careful, emotional being, had lost her child and performed a ritual of mourning that paralleled our own. No one could see this footage, ever, because the moment the world knew they could feel loss, they would become objects of study, specimens, resources. I deleted the photographs from my camera. I marked the location in my private notes, and I made a promise to the silence. I would protect this, whatever the cost. When I returned to the gravesite 3 days later, fresh flowers had been placed on the cairn. Not wildflowers grabbed hastily, carefully selected blooms. Lupine, Indian paintbrush, tiger lily, arranged with clear intentionality. She was still there, still mourning, and I was the only human who knew. The winter of 2013-2014 nearly broke me. I taught my undergraduate courses on autopilot, behavioral ecology, conservation biology, field research methods. I stood in front of students and lectured about scientific objectivity, data integrity, and the ethical responsibility to share discoveries with the academic community. I was living a lie. Every word felt hollow. Every principle I'd built my career on, transparency, peer review, reproducibility, I was actively violating. The cognitive dissonance was suffocating. My colleague, Dr. Sarah Vance, noticed. She cornered me after a department meeting in January. "You look like hell, Aaron." "Thanks. I'm serious, you haven't published in 2 years. You're dodging conference panels. Your grad students say you're distracted. What's going on?" I wanted to tell her. God, I wanted to tell someone. But how do you explain that you found proof of something the world insists doesn't exist, and that revealing it would destroy the very thing you found? "Just tired," I said. "Field fatigue. Then take a sabbatical. Go somewhere tropical. Get your head right." But I couldn't leave, because if I left, who would monitor the trail cameras? Who would redirect the hunters and thrill seekers? Who would stand between her and the world that would consume her? I returned to Olympic in May 2014 with a plan I hadn't fully articulated to myself. Escalate documentation, build an irrefutable archive, and then, what? Release it anonymously? Leak it to a conservation organization? Take it to my grave? I didn't know. But that summer, the forest gave me an answer I hadn't anticipated. She started leaving things for me. The first was a cluster of huckleberries placed on a flat rock near Station 3. Arranged, not scattered. I almost missed it. I'd walked past that rock 100 times, but something made me look twice. They were still fresh, placed within the last hour. A gift? A test? Communication? I didn't take them. Instead, I left something of my own. A handful of hazelnuts, carefully shelled, placed beside her offering. When I returned the next morning, both were gone. This happened 3 more times over the next 2 weeks. Different items, different locations, always within my patrol route. Always clearly intentional. She was acknowledging me, not as a threat or an intruder, but as something else. A neighbor, a fellow inhabitant. The relationship was shifting. I began documenting this exchange behavior meticulously. Dates, times, items, locations, photographic evidence. But I kept these records completely separate from my official field notes. This wasn't science anymore. This was dialogue. In July, I saw her again, closer than ever before. Maybe 60 feet. She was sitting on a downed log near the creek facing me. Not hiding, not fleeing, just sitting. We looked at each other for perhaps 3 minutes. I didn't move, didn't raise my camera. This wasn't a moment to document, this was a moment to experience. She made a sound. Low, brief, not aggressive, almost conversational. I nodded. I don't know why. It felt appropriate. She stood, that massive frame unfolding with surprising grace, and walked away. Not hurried, not furtive, just leaving. When she was gone, I found my hands shaking. That was the moment I knew. I couldn't do this alone anymore. I needed help. I needed someone I could trust. Someone who would understand what was at stake. I called Margaret Chen. We met at a diner in Port Angeles, far from the park, far from anyone who might overhear. I brought my laptop, an external drive, and 9 years of secrets. "Margaret, I need you to see something, and I need you to promise, no matter what, that you won't file an official report without talking to me first." She stirred her coffee slowly. "That's not how this works, Aaron." "I know. I'm asking anyway." She studied me. Then, "Show me." I opened the laptop, started with the audio files, the vocalizations, the response patterns, then the photographs, the burial site, the gift exchanges, the territorial markers, then the videos. I watched her face as she saw footage of Subject A foraging, teaching, mourning. Watched her expression shift from skepticism to confusion to something like awe. When the last video ended, she closed the laptop carefully. "How long?" she asked quietly. 9 years. Jesus, Aaron. I know. You understand what this is? Yes. And you've been sitting on it. To protect it. She looked out the window at the rain. You're right to be careful. If this gets out, when this gets out, it won't be controlled. It'll be chaos. Federal agencies, media circus, private interests. That forest will be overrun within weeks, which is why it can't get out. It's also the greatest zoological discovery of the century. You can't just bury it. Watch me. Margaret shook her head. There has to be a middle path. Documentation without exposure, protection through official designation. How? I don't know yet, but I'll help you figure it out. Because you're right. This is bigger than protocol. This is... Christ, I don't even have words for what this is. It's coexistence, I said. That's all. We're sharing space with something we didn't know existed, and we have a choice. Respect that or destroy it through curiosity. You can't make that choice alone. I already have. She was quiet for a long time. Then, I'll talk to the superintendent. Quietly. We'll start with what we can justify bureaucratically. Ecological sensitivity, watershed protection, erosion control. We'll close the area administratively for ongoing assessment. Will it work? It'll buy time. That's all I can promise. I nodded. It was more than I had before. We shook hands in the parking lot. Two scientists bound by something that transcended the institutions we served. Aaron, she called as I reached my car. You did the right thing, telling me. I wanted to believe her, but the weight of 9 years of silence didn't lift. It only spread. Summer 2015 brought revelation through tragedy. In early June, a series of wildfires broke out across the Olympic Peninsula. Lightning strikes during an unusual dry spell. 3 separate burns, none within my immediate research area, but close enough to alter wildlife patterns across the entire ecosystem. Smoke filled the valleys. Ash drifted through the canopy. Animals fled traditional territories. The forest I'd known for 6 years became alien, and she was vulnerable. I found her in late June, 3 miles further north than I'd ever documented her presence. She was favoring that left leg more severely now. The limp had progressed, and she wasn't alone. She had another juvenile, younger than the first, maybe 2 years old, judging by size and movement patterns, and it was struggling. The smoke had affected them both. I could hear it in their breathing, labored, wet, respiratory distress. The juvenile was coughing, a horrible sound that carried across the small clearing where I'd found them. They needed help. But approaching meant crossing a line I'd maintained for 6 years. Observation was one thing. Intervention was another. I watched for 2 hours, hidden, agonizing over the decision. She was trying. She'd found a seep spring with cleaner air. She was bringing the juvenile water using broad leaves as vessels. She was doing everything right with the tools she had. But it wasn't enough. I made a decision that still haunts me. I left, hiked 4 miles back to where I'd stashed emergency medical supplies, grabbed antibiotics, a nebulizer, sterile saline, equipment I'd carried for my own use, for emergencies. This was an emergency. I returned at dusk, set up 30 feet from where they were sheltering beneath an overhang, far enough to not crowd, close enough to be useful. I didn't approach directly. Instead, I set out what I'd brought: bottles of clean water, the nebulizer plugged into a portable battery, and pre-measured antibiotic doses in sealed containers with illustrated instructions. Illustrated, because I didn't know if she could read, but I knew she was intelligent enough to understand images. Then I retreated, climbed a tree 50 yards upslope where I could observe without imposing. She emerged an hour after full dark, approached my cache cautiously, circled it twice. The juvenile remained hidden, but I could hear its breathing. Ragged, desperate. She examined everything I'd left, picked up the water bottles. Screw caps were apparently familiar enough that she opened one on the first try. She drank, then brought it back to the juvenile. The nebulizer confused her. She turned it over, manipulated the buttons. When it powered on and began producing mist, she jerked back. But curiosity won. She watched the mist, then deliberately put her hand in the stream. Testing. Then she understood. She carried it back to the overhang. I heard sounds. Her vocalizations, reassuring. Then I heard the nebulizer running. Steady. For nearly 20 minutes. The juvenile's breathing eased. She used the supplies I'd left for 3 consecutive nights. Each morning I'd find the empty bottles neatly stacked, the nebulizer positioned where I could retrieve it for recharging. By the 4th night, the juvenile's breathing was clear. By the 5th, they'd moved on, back toward their core territory as the smoke began to clear. She left something behind. A carefully woven circle of cedar bark, about 8 inches in diameter, hung from a branch directly above where I'd left the supplies. Not random, not accidental. A message. Gratitude. I sat beneath that circle and confronted what I'd become. Not a scientist, not an observer. I was an active participant in their survival. I'd crossed the line, and I couldn't uncross it. But more than that, I'd proven something I'd suspected but never confirmed. She understood reciprocity, symbolic communication, and the concept of interspecies cooperation. She was more human than the world was ready to accept. That summer, I told Margaret everything, showed her the medical intervention records, the cedar circle, which I'd carefully preserved. You medicated an unknown species without ethical board approval, without established dosing protocols, without... I know. Aaron, if this were officially reported, you'd lose your license. You'd be barred from fieldwork for life. I know. She rubbed her temples. But you probably saved them. Yes. And she thanked you. Yes. Margaret looked at the cedar circle for a long time. This changes the calculus. If there's evidence of cooperative behavior, of cross-species communication, of culture, we can build a protection framework on that. Endangered status, critical habitat designation, federal protection, which requires disclosure. Yes. Which brings the circus. Not if we control the narrative, not if we establish protections before we release evidence. You're talking about years of bureaucratic process. I'm talking about the only way this ends with them still alive and undisturbed. She was right. I knew she was right. But the thought of what would follow, the scrutiny, the debate, the inevitable attempts at capture and study, made me sick. Give me one more summer, I said. Let me document what we need for irrefutable proof. Then we'll figure out the path forward. Margaret agreed, but she added a condition. No more solo intervention. If something happens, you call me. We do this right, or we don't do it at all. I agreed, though I knew it was a lie. If they needed help again, I wouldn't wait for permission. That fall, I returned to the burial site I'd found in 2013. Someone, she, had maintained it. Fresh flowers, stones rearranged. 2 years of grief, sustained and intentional. I understood then that whatever we decided, whatever happened next, I was morally obligated to ensure the world knew. These beings felt loss. They mourned their dead. They helped their young. They thanked those who helped them. They were people, by every definition that mattered, and we were running out of time to save them. The summer of 2016 brought the researchers, not the YouTubers or cryptid hunters, actual scientists. A team from NOAA monitoring post-fire ecosystem recovery. They set up a base camp 7 miles southeast of my zone, but their survey range overlapped with the periphery of Subject A's territory. I met their team lead, Dr. Marcus Webb, during a chance encounter at the ranger station. 40s confident funded, he was everything I used to be. You're Feldman, right? The wolf guy? Was. Pivoted to broader ecosystem monitoring. Smart. Predator-prey dynamics are saturated. I read your early work. Solid stuff. You still publish? Not recently. Academic politics? Something like that. He studied me with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades reading people in the field. Well, if you're around this summer, we could use local knowledge. We're tracking post-disturbance recovery patterns, particularly interested in how large mammals are recolonizing burned areas. Warning bells. What species specifically? Bears, primarily. But we're keeping instruments open to whatever shows up. Thermal cameras, audio arrays, drone surveys. Pretty comprehensive toolkit. Drones. That's thorough, I managed. Got to be. Grant funding requires demonstrable innovation. Plus, the technology's finally catching up to the terrain challenges. We can cover 10 times the ground we could even 5 years ago. He said it like it was progress. Like surveillance capacity was something to celebrate. I spent that night reviewing maps, cross-referencing Webb's survey grid with my own documentation of Subject A's movement patterns. There was overlap. Not much, maybe 15%, but enough. Enough that a drone flight at the wrong time in the wrong drainage could capture something that would detonate every protection effort Margaret and I had been building. I had to redirect them. Over the next week, I visited Webb's camp 3 times. Casual consultation visits, shared coffee, compared notes, established collegial rapport, and carefully, systematically, fed him misleading information. Heavy bear activity in the Queets drainage, I'd mention. Saw multiple sows with cubs. Perfect for your recovery baseline. The northern survey sections are mostly deadfall right now. You'll burn days cutting trail for minimal data return. If you're serious about comprehensive coverage, the Ho River corridor has way more accessible sampling points. Every suggestion pushed them away from her. Webb trusted me. Why wouldn't he? We spoke the same language. Conservation biology, statistical methodology, shared frustration with funding cycles. I was helping him succeed. I was lying to a colleague to protect something I couldn't tell him about. The ethical rot spread deeper every day, but it worked. Webb's team concentrated their efforts south and east. Their drones never flew the critical corridors. Their thermal cameras never caught what mine had. Then, in late July, two things happened. First, Margaret called. The superintendent had approved a preliminary closure proposal, 22 square miles including the core territory, designated for sensitive habitat restoration following fire disturbance. It would go into effect after public comment period, late August, early September. We were close. Second, Webb made a discovery. He found one of my camera traps, Station 3, the one I'd relocated 4 times over 7 years, always keeping it active in Subject A's range. I was at my camp when he hiked up, SD card in hand, expression unreadable. Aaron. Interesting conversation we need to have. My stomach dropped. What's up? He held up the card. Found a camera station about 2 miles northwest. Not marked on any official survey grid. Not mentioned in any park permits I can access. Private equipment. But it's got Park Service inventory tags. I'd gotten sloppy. Too focused on the subjects. Not careful enough about the paper trail. Yeah, I said carefully. That's mine. Secondary monitoring for longitudinal data. Should have logged it better. Should have. He turned the card over in his hands. You review this footage yet? Not this week. Why? Because there's something on here. Something I need you to explain. He pulled out his laptop, opened a video file. Date stamp, July 18, 2016. Time, 04:37 a.m. and there she was. 53 seconds of clear footage. Subject A moving through the frame. Bipedal, unmistakable, followed by the juvenile. Healthy now. Thriving. Tell me that's a person in a suit, Webb said quietly. I could have lied. Could have laughed it off, claimed costume hoaxers, deleted the file and explained away the anomaly. But looking at that footage, the most beautiful documentation I'd ever captured of them together, I couldn't. Marcus, sit down. Because what I'm about to tell you will reframe every assumption you've made about this forest, I told him. Not everything, but enough. The history, the observations, the ethical framework that had governed my silence, the protection measures being put in place. He listened without interrupting, watched the other video files I showed him, examined the audio spectrograms, reviewed my field notes from 9 years. When I finished, he sat in silence for 5 full minutes. Then, you've been sitting on the most significant zoological discovery in a century. To protect it, that's not your decision to make. It absolutely is. Because the alternative is what? Publication? Media? That family dead within a year from stress, disease, or some asshole with a rifle and a YouTube channel? Science doesn't work on secrecy. Science also doesn't work if it destroys what it studies. Webb stood, paced. There are protocols. Endangered species designation. Federal protection. We are. Margaret Chen and I have been building the framework for 2 years. It goes into effect in 6 weeks. And then, maybe then, we can discuss controlled disclosure, but not before the habitat is legally protected. And if I don't agree to wait? I met his eyes. Then you're the person who kills them, because that's what premature disclosure means. You might as well pull the trigger yourself. Low blow, but true. Webb was silent for a long time. Then, show me. In person. I need to see them. No. Aaron. No. My documentation is enough. You don't get to turn them into your data points. That's not fair. Fair? I laughed bitterly. None of this is fair. Fair would be a world where they could exist without us deciding their fate. But that's not the world we live in. Webb left without another word, took his equipment, his team, and departed the park within 72 hours. He never published, never leaked, never told another soul, because he understood, finally, what I'd understood for 9 years. Some knowledge is a burden, not a trophy. And sometimes the most important thing a scientist can do is choose silence over citation. August 2017 arrived with unseasonable heat. The forest was tinder dry, despite the region's reputation for rain. Fire danger ratings hit extreme. Park officials closed multiple trail systems. My permit was technically invalid, Backcountry access was restricted to emergency personnel. I went anyway, because she was in danger, and I was the only one who knew. The heat had driven her territory shift again. She'd moved to a higher elevation where the spring-fed creeks still flowed. I tracked her through careful observation of her trail markers, the subtle breaks in undergrowth, the arranged stones, the territorial boundary signifiers I'd learned to read over 9 years. I found them on August 14th, a small meadow at roughly 4,200 feet. She was there with the juvenile, now nearly her size. They were resting in afternoon shade, conserving energy. I maintained my usual distance, sat downwind, made no sudden movements. She knew I was there. She always knew. But this time something was different. She stood, not to leave, but to approach, deliberate, purposeful. She walked to within 30 feet, closer than we'd ever been. The juvenile stayed behind, watching. We looked at each other. Her eyes were amber brown, intelligent, assessing. I could see the gray in her hair, the scars on her hands, the weight of years spent surviving in a world that had forgotten her kind existed. She made a sound, that low, resonant hum I'd first heard 9 years earlier. But the tone was different, not communication between her kind. This was directed at me. I didn't respond verbally, but I nodded. Acknowledgement. She tilted her head, studied me with an intensity that felt like being seen straight through. Then she reached down, picked up a branch about 3 feet long, recently fallen, and deliberately snapped it in half. One break. Clean. Purposeful. She held both pieces for a moment, then placed them on the ground in front of her. Parallel. Equal. Then she turned and walked back to the juvenile. They moved together into the tree line, and they were gone. I stared at those 2 pieces of wood for a long time, trying to understand. Then it hit me. Balance, equality, coexistence. She was telling me she understood the arrangement, the unspoken agreement we'd maintained for 9 years. 2 species, sharing space, parallel lives, equal respect. It was acknowledgement, and goodbye. I never saw them again. On August 28, 2017, the National Park Service implemented emergency closure protocols for a 42-square-mile section of Olympic National Park. Official justification: extreme fire danger, compromised trail infrastructure, and sensitive habitat requiring protection during post-disturbance recovery period. Margaret had worked miracles behind the scenes. The closure was indefinite, subject to annual review. No sunset clause. No public access timeline. The forest was sealed. YouTubers complained. Bigfoot enthusiast forums exploded with conspiracy theories. Local hiking groups protested. But the bureaucratic machinery ground forward, indifferent to public opinion, and Subject A's territory became functionally a protected zone. I submitted my final field report in September. 17 pages of ecological data, watershed analysis, and carnivore population dynamics. Everything the Park Service needed to justify their closure. I mentioned nothing about her. My data hard drives, 9 years of footage, audio, field notes, everything, I encrypted and stored in 3 separate locations. Safety deposit box in Seattle, my brother's house in Vermont, and one buried in a waterproof container in the forest itself. Coordinates memorized, location marked only in my private journals, evidence preserved, but not released. Dr. Webb published a paper on post-fire ecosystem recovery in 2018. Solid work. No mention of anomalous findings. He'd kept his word. Margaret retired in 2019. We still exchange emails occasionally. She never asks directly, but her questions carry weight. How's the locked section recovering? Any indication the closure should be modified? My answers are always the same. Habitat needs more time. Keep it closed. I left Olympic National Park in 2018. Took a teaching position in Massachusetts. Urban campus. Predictable schedule. Safe. I tell my students about the importance of field research, the ethics of observation, the responsibility scientists carry when they discover something precious and fragile. I don't tell them about her, but sometimes late at night I review the footage. Watch her teach her juvenile to forage. Watch her mourn at the gravesite. Watch her approach me that last time. Break the branch, demonstrate her understanding of balance. And I wonder, did I do the right thing? I protected a species by denying it recognition. I preserved their existence by erasing proof they exist. I chose their survival over my career, my reputation, my contribution to scientific knowledge. Some colleagues think I burned out. Others believe I faked my data and fled before being caught. My ex-wife thinks I had a breakdown and invented elaborate justifications for failure. Let them think what they want. Because somewhere in the Olympic wilderness, in a forest now protected by bureaucratic designation and public disinterest, a family might still move through the old-growth timber, might still teach their young to recognize which plants heal and which harm, might still stack stones in territorial markers and break branches to say too close. And they do it in silence, unknown, unproven, free. There are costs to carrying secrets. I learned this the way anyone learns important truths, slowly, through accumulated weight rather than sudden revelation. My career never recovered. The expected trajectory, tenure, department chair, prestigious publications, evaporated. I'm an associate professor at a mid-tier state university, teaching introductory courses to undergraduates who will never remember my name. My marriage ended in 2014. "You're married to that forest," she told me. She wasn't wrong. I don't have children. Don't have close friends. Most people find me distant, distracted. He's somewhere else, they say. And they're right. Part of me never left that foggy creek bed, that moss-covered nurse log, that moment of eye contact with something that shouldn't exist. But these costs feel trivial against what was preserved. Because the closure held. 11 years now. The YouTubers found other mysteries. The cryptid hunters moved on to more accessible locations. The occasional hiker who complains about restricted access is mollified by ranger explanations about ongoing ecological sensitivity. The forest went quiet again, and in that quiet, something ancient continues. I monitor from a distance. Check satellite imagery quarterly. No unusual activity, no encroachment. Margaret's successor maintains the closure designation, reviews it annually with the same boilerplate justification we established in 2017. As far as institutional memory is concerned, that section of forest needs indefinite protection because of fire recovery patterns and watershed sensitivity. The truth, that we're guarding the last habitat of an undiscovered hominid species, exists only in encrypted files and the memories of 3 people bound by choices we can never undo. Do I regret it? That's the question I ask myself most often. Late nights, whiskey, old footage playing silently on my laptop. I could have published, could have been famous. The discoverer of Subject A, the scientist who proved Bigfoot was real. Book deals, documentary series, the lecture circuit, and she would have died. Not immediately, but inevitably, from the stress of helicopters overhead, from respiratory disease introduced by the research teams, from the bullet of some trophy hunter who'd see her not as a person, but as the ultimate prize. Or worse, she'd have lived in captivity, behind glass, studied, measured, reduced from mystery to data point, her intelligence quantified, her grief dissected, her final years spent confirming what I already knew, that she was a person, deserving dignity and freedom. Science is built on sharing, on peer review, on the principle that knowledge belongs to humanity, not individuals. But what happens when knowledge itself becomes a weapon against the very thing discovered? Then the ethical framework shifts. Then the scientist becomes guardian. Then publication becomes betrayal. I made peace with that choice years ago. I still dream about her sometimes. In the dreams, I'm back in the forest. She's there, at the edge of the clearing. The juvenile, grown now, maybe with young of its own, stands beside her. She looks at me, that amber-eyed gaze that sees everything, and I know she understands, that she knows what I gave up to give them silence, that she recognizes the sacrifice, even if she can't name it. In the dream, she nods. Once. Acknowledgement between 2 beings who shared space and never spoke. Then she turns and they fade into the trees. I wake feeling something I can only describe as blessed. My students sometimes ask why I'm so adamant about ethical frameworks in conservation. Why I spend entire lectures on the principle that sometimes the best action is inaction, that sometimes protection means obscurity. I tell them about habitat corridors, about minimum viable populations, about the dangers of overstudying sensitive species. I don't tell them about Station 3, about the Cedar Circle, about the last time I saw 2 figures moving through the Olympic old growth, parallel to human world, separate from it, surviving because no one knew they were there. One student, sharp, curious, destined for better things than I achieved, asked me once, "But don't we have an obligation to truth? Isn't hiding information just another form of control?" "Yes," I told her, And sometimes control is exactly what's needed. Because truth without wisdom is just noise, and noise can be deadly. She didn't understand. Not yet. But maybe someday she'll stand in a forest somewhere, witness something impossible, and face the same choice I did. Document and destroy, or guard and protect. If that day comes, I hope she chooses silence. The hard drives remain encrypted. The burial site coordinates exist only in my memory. The footage that could rewrite zoology textbooks sits in 3 separate locations. Password protected, waiting for, what? A better world? One ready to coexist rather than consume? That seems unlikely. My death, perhaps. When I'm gone, someone will find the keys, will open the files, will see what I saw. And then it won't be my choice anymore. It'll be theirs. I've made peace with that too. Because the alternative, destroying the evidence entirely, feels like an equal betrayal. Erasing them from history as completely as if they'd never existed. So the proof remains, suspended, waiting for a world wise enough to receive it without destroying what it reveals. I'm 62 now. Clean bill of health, but that's negotiable. Another 20 years if I'm lucky. Another 30 if medicine continues advancing. I hope she's still alive, that she taught her children the boundaries, that they learned to recognize the warning signs, the increased human activity, the dangerous curiosity, the need to retreat further into the ever-shrinking wild. I hope they survive me, and I hope that when someone finally opens those files, sees that footage, reads these words, they'll understand the choice, that they'll see it not as a scientist failing to share a discovery, but as a human being choosing coexistence over conquest. There are places where the world resists being known. Deep forests where the canopy is so thick that even satellites can't penetrate. Canyons so remote that no trail reaches them. Silence is so profound that your own heartbeat becomes a conversation. In those places, ancient things persist. Not supernatural, just rare. Not magical, just undiscovered. Not monsters, just neighbors we've forgotten to respect. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest gift we can offer them is to look away, to mark the borders of their existence and agree collectively that some mysteries are more valuable unsolved, some truths are better kept silent, some families deserve to live unknown, unbothered, unproven. In a world that demands evidence for everything, maybe the most radical act is faith. Faith that absence of proof is not proof of absence. Faith that what we can't see might be thriving specifically because we're not looking. I chose to believe. I chose to protect. I chose silence over certainty. And somewhere in the Olympic wilderness, beneath ancient trees and patient stars, something still moves through the forest, still breaking branches to mark territory, still stacking stones to honor loss, still teaching their young that humans mostly can be avoided and that, despite everything, is enough.